I was staying in this fancy hotel for a business trip, just trying to wind down after a long day of meetings. It was late, and I was getting ready to call it a night when there was a knock on my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, especially not room service. I hesitated but decided to open it, thinking it might be a mistake. The hotel staff member had a tray with covered dishes. I was confused. I hadn't ordered anything. I told him that, but he insisted it was for my room and said it was complimentary from the hotel. It seemed odd, but I let him in, thinking maybe it was a nice gesture from the hotel management. He placed the tray on the table and left quickly without saying much. I found it strange, but I was hungry, so I lifted the covers to see what was there. The sight made my blood run cold. There were strange items, photos, old toys, and newspaper clippings, all arranged in a bizarre way that sent chills down my spine. I couldn't make sense of it. The photos looked old, like they were taken decades ago. Some were of kids, their faces obscured or scratched out. The toys were worn out, and the newspaper clippings had articles about missing children. I felt this overwhelming sense of dread, this feeling that something was very wrong. My heart raced, and I started feeling sick to my stomach. I wondered if this was some kind of sick prank or if there was a mix-up with another room. I called the front desk, trying to explain what happened, but they insisted there must have been a mistake. They said they'd send someone up to collect the items and investigate. I couldn't shake off this feeling of fear, this sense of being targeted or watched. I locked the door and stayed up the whole night, too scared to sleep, too terrified of what those items might mean. The hotel staff came in the morning to collect the tray, but they seemed dismissive, like they were trying to downplay the situation. They assured me it was just a mix-up and that I shouldn't worry. But I couldn't shake off the images I saw, the disturbing arrangement of those items. I tried to go about my day, but I couldn't focus, couldn't get the thoughts out of my head. I decided to do some digging of my own, searching online for any news about missing children in the area. And to my horror, I found articles matching the dates on those newspaper clippings. It felt surreal, this sinking feeling that those items might be connected to real tragedies. I called the police, telling them about what happened, but they seemed skeptical and said they'd look into it. I felt this paralyzing fear, this sense of being entangled in something dark and disturbing. I couldn't trust anyone, not knowing if this was a terrible mistake or something more sinister. I checked out of the hotel, unable to stay there another minute. I felt this need to get away, to distance myself from that place and those eerie items. The police contacted me later, saying they investigated but found nothing suspicious. They dismissed it as a mix-up, but I knew what I saw, what I felt. It was real. I was excited about attending this big conference, looking forward to networking and learning new things. But when I arrived at the hotel, I found out I had a roommate assigned to me. I didn't mind sharing, thinking it might be a good chance to meet someone new. At first, everything seemed fine. We exchanged polite greetings, and I thought it would be okay. But as the days went by, my roommate's behavior started to change. She became increasingly aggressive and confrontational over trivial things, like the room temperature or the TV volume. I tried to diffuse the tension, thinking maybe she was just stressed or having a bad day. But her behavior only escalated. She'd snap at me for no reason, making me feel uncomfortable and on edge in my own space. I couldn't understand what I did to upset her. I tried to be accommodating, adjusting to her requests, but nothing seemed to make her happy. It was like walking on eggshells around her. One night, I came back to the room late after attending a networking event. She was sitting on her bed, glaring at me with this intense, unsettling look in her eyes. I felt this surge of fear, this feeling that something wasn't right. I tried to avoid confrontation, quickly getting ready for bed and keeping to myself. But she started making snide remarks, saying things that felt threatening and hostile. It sent shivers down my spine. I didn't want to provoke her, so I kept quiet, trying to ignore her hostile behavior. But it was getting harder to ignore, this feeling of being trapped in a confined space with someone who seemed to despise me for no reason. The tension in the room was palpable. I couldn't sleep, feeling this sense of unease, this fear that something might happen while I was vulnerable and asleep. I decided to talk to the hotel staff about changing rooms, explaining the situation. They seemed sympathetic but said they were fully booked and couldn't accommodate the request. I felt this overwhelming sense of dread, this feeling of being stuck in a situation that was turning increasingly hostile. I considered leaving the conference early, but I didn't want to miss out on the opportunity. I tried to spend as much time out of the room as possible, attending workshops and networking events, just to avoid being around her. But every time I returned, the atmosphere in the room felt suffocating, this sense of being watched and targeted. One evening, she confronted me in the room, yelling and accusing me of things I didn't do. Her voice was filled with rage, and I felt this surge of panic, not knowing how to handle the situation. I tried to reason with her, to calm her down, but it only made her more aggressive. She started getting physical, blocking my way and intimidating me. I felt this overwhelming fear, this feeling of being threatened and unsafe. I managed to slip past her and rush to the hotel lobby, seeking help from the staff. They intervened and separated us, but I was shaking, feeling this trauma from the confrontation. They moved me to a different room, away from her. But the fear lingered, this feeling of being targeted and intimidated by someone I barely knew. I was on a business trip, staying at this upscale hotel. Everything seemed fine at first, a routine check-in, a standard room, and a busy schedule ahead. But then things took a turn. I received a call from the hotel reception, asking me to come down urgently. They said they needed to discuss a security issue regarding my stay. I was puzzled but made my way to the lobby. The hotel manager greeted me, looking visibly concerned. They explained that there had been a data breach in their system and that personal information, including mine, had been compromised. It hit me like a punch. I felt exposed, vulnerable. They assured me they were taking measures to rectify the situation, but the damage was done. I felt this unsettling fear, this sense of invasion of my privacy. They said they'd keep me updated, and I went back to my room, trying to shake off the unease. That night, as I returned from dinner, I found my room in disarray. Drawers were open, papers were scattered, and my laptop seemed tampered with. I froze, feeling this chill crawl up my spine. I knew something wasn't right. I checked my belongings, trying to figure out if anything was missing, but it all seemed intact. It was eerie, this feeling of someone having been in my room, rifling through my things. I went to the front desk, telling them what happened, but they dismissed it, saying it was probably just housekeeping. But I knew it wasn't. There was this unsettling feeling that someone had targeted me after the data breach. The following days, strange things started happening. I received mysterious calls with heavy breathing on the other end, making my heart race every time the phone rang. I tried blocking the numbers, but they kept coming from different ones. Then, I started noticing someone following me. It was subtle at first, just glimpses of someone shadowing me from a distance. But it kept happening, this feeling of being watched wherever I went. I felt this constant fear, this sense of being stalked and targeted. I tried to reason with myself, telling myself it was paranoia, but the evidence was there, the feeling of being hunted. One evening, I returned to my room to find a note slipped under my door. It was chilling. It contained details about my personal life, things only someone with access to my information would know. It made my blood run cold, this feeling of being violated and threatened. I called the hotel staff again, but they seemed indifferent, brushing it off as a misunderstanding or someone's prank. But it didn't feel like a joke, it felt like someone was tormenting me, using my stolen information against me. I couldn't sleep, feeling this constant anxiety and fear. Every noise outside my door felt threatening, every phone call a potential threat. I was on edge, unable to trust anyone, not knowing who was behind this torment. I considered leaving the hotel, but I didn't feel safe anywhere. I felt trapped, this feeling of being targeted and hunted, with no way out. The situation escalated when I received a package addressed to my room. Inside were photos of me taken without my knowledge in various places around the hotel. It felt invasive, this violation of my privacy. I called the police, explaining everything, but without concrete evidence, they said there was little they could do. I felt this overwhelming sense of helplessness, this fear that I was alone in this nightmare. I decided to check out, to leave that place behind. But as I was packing, I heard someone trying to open my door. I froze, feeling this surge of panic, and I barricaded myself inside, not knowing what to do. I called for help, but no one came. I heard footsteps outside, someone trying to force their way in. It was terrifying, this feeling of being trapped and vulnerable. Eventually, the noise stopped, and I cautiously opened the door, finding the hallway empty. I rushed out, leaving everything behind, not looking back. I reported everything to the police, but they couldn't find any leads. I felt this lingering fear, this trauma from the terrifying encounters, this feeling of being hunted and targeted because of the breach of my personal information. We were on a road trip, me and my fiancée, just cruising down the highway. It was getting late, and we decided to stop at this small, rundown motel we spotted. It looked deserted, but we were too tired to keep driving. The motel clerk seemed off, this uneasy vibe about him. He gave us a room key without much conversation, just this cold, distant stare. I didn't like it, but I brushed it off, thinking maybe he was just tired or had a bad day. As we settled in the room, things felt eerie. The place had this musty smell, and the flickering lights made it feel like something out of a horror movie. My fiancée laughed it off, saying it had a certain charm, but I couldn't shake off this feeling of discomfort. Later that night, I woke up to this strange noise outside our window. I peeked through the curtains and saw this man standing in the shadows, staring at our room. It sent shivers down my spine, this feeling of being watched by a complete stranger in the middle of nowhere. I nudged my fiancée awake, whispering about the man outside. He went to check, but when he looked out, there was no one there. I felt this overwhelming fear, this sense of someone lurking just beyond our sight. We tried to go back to sleep, but I couldn't shake off this feeling of dread. It felt wrong, this strange man watching us in the dead of night. The next morning, we mentioned it to the motel clerk, but he brushed it off, saying it must have been a misunderstanding. He seemed dismissive, like he didn't want to talk about it. We decided to stay another night, thinking maybe it was just our imagination playing tricks on us. But that night, it happened again. I woke up to that same noise outside the window. I mustered the courage to look, and there he was, that man, staring directly at us. I screamed for my fiancé, and he rushed to the window, but the man was gone again. I felt this overwhelming panic, this fear that something sinister was happening. We packed our things immediately, not wanting to stay another second in that place. As we were leaving, I saw the motel clerk talking to the man outside, this eerie exchange that sent chills down my spine. We drove off, feeling this sense of relief, but I couldn't shake off the fear from that encounter. I felt like that man was still watching us, following us somehow. We stopped at a diner to grab a bite, trying to shake off the unease. But as we left, I saw him again, that man, standing across the street, staring at us with this menacing look. It was terrifying, this feeling of being targeted by a stranger we encountered at that creepy motel. We tried to lose him by taking different routes, but he kept appearing, always watching us from a distance. It felt like he was following us, this relentless pursuit that sent waves of terror through me. I called the police, but without evidence of any crime, there wasn't much they could do. We felt trapped, this feeling of being stalked by someone who seemed to have ill intentions. We decided to drive straight to a busy area, hoping to lose him in the crowd. It seemed to work for a while, but then I saw him again, this time right behind us in traffic. I felt this overwhelming sense of dread, this fear that he wouldn't stop following us. We made a sudden turn, trying to lose him, but it was no use. He kept following, this relentless pursuit that felt like a nightmare. I was terrified, not knowing what he wanted or why he was fixated on us. We finally reached a police station, rushing inside for help. The man didn't follow us inside, disappearing into the streets. I felt this immense relief, but the fear still lingered, this feeling of being targeted and hunted by a stranger. The police took our statement, but without much to go on, they couldn't do much. I felt this overwhelming sense of vulnerability, this fear that he might appear again at any moment. We changed our plans, trying to avoid the areas we had been to before. But I couldn't shake off this fear that he was still out there, somewhere, watching and waiting. I was staying at this hotel for a work conference, just trying to make the most out of my time. Everything was fine at first, the usual check-in, the comfy room, and the busy schedule. But then things started to feel strange. One night, I heard a knock on my door. It was late, way past midnight. I checked the peephole, but I couldn't see anyone. It felt odd, but I brushed it off as maybe someone had the wrong room. The following evening, I was getting ready for bed when I heard a faint noise outside. I peeked through the peephole again and saw a figure walking away. A maintenance uniform caught my eye. It was weird. Why would maintenance be here so late? I didn't think much of it at first, assuming they might be fixing something urgent. But then it started happening almost every night, a knock on the door, a glimpse of that maintenance uniform disappearing down the hallway. It made me feel uneasy, this sense of someone lurking around at odd hours. I tried asking the hotel staff about it, but they seemed unaware of any late-night maintenance requests for my room. One evening, as I returned from dinner, I saw the same maintenance worker in the hallway. I decided to approach him, asking if there was any issue with my room that needed fixing. He seemed surprised, almost caught off guard, and said there was nothing wrong. It was strange. His response didn't sit well with me. I started feeling this creeping sense of discomfort, this fear that something wasn't right. I tried to shake it off, but then I noticed something unsettling, a key card left behind in the hallway. It looked like the ones the hotel staff used. I picked it up, thinking maybe it belonged to the maintenance worker, but it felt off, like it wasn't supposed to be there. That night, I heard noises coming from the hallway, soft footsteps, faint but distinct. I felt this surge of fear, this realization that someone might be trying to enter my room. I double-checked the locks, feeling this overwhelming sense of vulnerability. I barely slept, feeling this constant anxiety and fear. The next morning, I went down to the front desk, trying to explain what happened. They assured me they'd investigate, but I couldn't shake off this feeling of being watched and targeted. As the days passed, the encounters continued. I'd catch glimpses of the maintenance worker at odd hours, this feeling of being followed wherever I went. It was terrifying, this sense of being stalked by someone with access to the hotel. I started avoiding going back to my room directly, trying to see if the pattern would change. But every time I returned, that feeling of unease lingered, this fear that someone was trying to gain access to my room without permission. One night, I heard someone fumbling with the doorknob. I froze, feeling this surge of terror, and quickly pushed the hotel furniture against the door, trying to block it. My heart raced as I called the front desk, telling them someone was trying to get into my room. They sent security up immediately. When they arrived, they found the same maintenance worker in the hallway, claiming he was just doing a routine check. But it felt wrong, this constant appearance at odd hours without any official reason. I demanded answers, feeling this mix of fear and anger. The hotel assured me they'd investigate further, but I couldn't stay there another night. I packed my bags and checked out, feeling this overwhelming relief to leave that place behind. I reported everything to the authorities, but there wasn't much they could do without concrete evidence. I felt this lingering fear, this trauma from the terrifying encounters, this feeling of being hunted and targeted because of the unsettling appearances of that maintenance worker. I was on a road trip when my car decided to call it quits. It was late, and the only place nearby was this old, rundown motel. The clerk seemed disinterested, but I didn't have many options. I took the room key and settled in for the night. Around midnight, my phone rang. I groggily answered, expecting maybe a tow service or someone checking on my car. But it was this weird static, and then silence. I shrugged it off, thinking it was a wrong number or bad reception. Then it happened again, the same static followed by silence. I felt this unease creeping up on me. I tried calling back, but it went straight to voicemail. I dismissed it, thinking maybe it was just a prank or a technical glitch. But the calls kept coming, always at odd hours. It was unsettling, this sense of someone watching, someone keeping tabs on me. I tried blocking the number, but the calls continued from different unknown numbers each time. The caller's tone changed. It went from static to heavy breathing, then to whispers. The voice threatened me, said things that made my blood run cold. It felt personal, like they knew me. I reported it to the motel staff, but they couldn't do much. They said they didn't have any records of unusual activity. I felt this growing fear, this sense of being trapped in a place where someone was tormenting me. I barely slept, feeling this constant dread, this fear that the calls might escalate. I wanted to leave, but my car was still in bad shape, and I had no other options. One night, the caller mentioned details about my trip, things only someone following me could know. I felt this surge of panic, this realization that I was being watched, targeted by someone with sinister intentions. I called the police, but without solid evidence, they couldn't do much. I felt this overwhelming vulnerability, this fear that the caller might know where I was. The calls continued, growing more menacing each time. They threatened my safety, said things that felt like a direct threat. I tried to reason, to ask what they wanted, but there was only silence or more threats. I barricaded myself in the room, trying to block out the world outside, but the fear kept gnawing at me. I felt trapped, this feeling of being hunted by an unknown assailant. I couldn't trust anyone, couldn't sleep, couldn't focus. It was a nightmare, this constant barrage of calls, this fear that the caller might act on their threats. I begged the motel staff for help, but they seemed indifferent, like they didn't believe me or didn't want to get involved. I felt this isolation, this overwhelming fear that I was alone in this nightmare. One night, the caller mentioned details about my childhood, things no stranger could know. It felt like they were taunting me, this feeling of being invaded, of someone digging into my past. I considered leaving on foot, but it was late, and the roads were deserted. I felt this panic, this fear that if I stepped out, I'd be exposed to whoever was tormenting me. I was paranoid, constantly checking the peephole, feeling this dread that someone might be lurking outside my door. Every sound made me jump, every shadow felt threatening. I didn't know what to do, who to turn to. The calls persisted, this unending torment that felt like it would never stop. I felt this desperation, this urge to escape, to find safety somewhere, anywhere. Eventually, the call stopped, abruptly, without warning. I felt this eerie silence, this lingering fear that it might start again. I didn't know if it was over or just a temporary pause. I packed my things and left the motel, not looking back. I had a fight with my partner and needed a place to crash for the night, so I checked into this family-owned motel off the main road. The place was run down, but I didn't have many options. The owners were friendly, but something felt off, a vibe that I couldn't shake. As I settled in, I overheard the owners talking about the previous guests, saying things that didn't sit right. It was like they were keeping tabs on them, their personal lives, their comings and goings. I brushed it off, thinking maybe it was just my imagination. Late at night, I heard noises coming from the room next door. It sounded like someone sobbing, distressed. I debated whether to intervene, but I didn't want to pry into someone else's business. The next day, I noticed this strange pattern. The owners were overly interested in my plans, my whereabouts. It felt invasive, this constant questioning, this feeling like they were keeping an eye on me. I brushed it off, thinking maybe they were just being hospitable. But then I stumbled upon something unsettling, a guest book filled with names and details of every visitor, almost like a journal tracking everyone who stayed there. The entries were too detailed, too personal. It was eerie, this feeling of intrusion into the guests' lives. I felt this growing sense of unease, this fear that something sinister was happening behind closed doors. As days passed, I noticed peculiar things. The owners seemed to have access to the guests' rooms even when they weren't around. I heard whispers about hidden cameras, about watching the guests' every move. I couldn't shake off this fear, this sense of being watched, of my privacy being violated. I tried to reason with myself, to convince myself it was just paranoia, but the evidence was there, this constant surveillance. One evening, as I returned to my room, I found the door slightly ajar. It felt wrong, this feeling of someone having been inside, rifling through my things. I checked, and nothing seemed missing, but the fear lingered. I considered leaving, finding another place, but I felt trapped, this feeling of being watched no matter where I went. I tried to confront the owners, but they brushed off my concerns, saying it was for the safety of their guests. I started noticing other guests behaving strangely, looking over their shoulders, whispering about feeling watched. It was chilling, this realization that I wasn't the only one feeling this fear. One night, I heard a guest screaming from a nearby room. I rushed to help, but when I knocked, everything went silent. The owners said it was a misunderstanding, that the guest had left suddenly. But it felt wrong, this sense of someone being in distress, and then silence. I felt this growing dread, this fear that something terrible was happening in that motel, something hidden and dark. I didn't know who to turn to, who to trust. I felt this overwhelming sense of vulnerability, this fear that I was next. I tried to gather evidence, to find something concrete to prove what was happening, but it was like they were always a step ahead, covering their tracks. One night, I noticed a hidden camera in my room. It felt violating, this invasion of my privacy. I knew I had to get out, to escape that place before something worse happened. I left in the middle of the night, not looking back. I reported everything to the police department, but without solid proof, they couldn't take action. I was on a business trip trying to close some deals out of town and booked a room at this old hotel that had a certain vintage charm. I was tired, heading back to my room after a long day of meetings, when I made a wrong turn and ended up in a corridor that looked unused, forgotten almost. There was a door slightly ajar at the end of the hall, and curiosity got the best of me. I pushed it open, expecting to find a storage room or something, but what I saw was something entirely different. The room was huge, unlike any other in the hotel. It looked like it hadn't been touched in ages. Dust covered everything, and the air felt stale. I hesitated, thinking I should leave, but then I heard whispers, faint but distinct. I peeked around the corner and saw a group of people, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, standing in a circle. They were chanting something, words I couldn't understand. It felt surreal, like I stumbled into a secret ritual or something. My heart raced, but I was frozen in place, unable to move or make a sound. They were so focused on whatever they were doing that they didn't notice me. Then, one of them looked directly at me, their eyes piercing through the darkness. I felt this overwhelming sense of dread, this fear that they knew I was there, witnessing something I wasn't supposed to see. I stumbled backward, trying to find my way out, but it was like the corridor had shifted, like the walls were closing in on me. Panic set in, this feeling of being trapped in this strange, hidden part of the hotel. I finally found the door I came through, but it wouldn't budge. It was like it was locked from the outside. I was panicking, this fear of being stuck in this eerie place with no way out. I heard footsteps approaching, this slow, deliberate sound that sent chills down my spine. I tried to hide, but there was nowhere to go. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped right behind me. I turned around, and there was no one there. I felt this growing sense of terror, this fear that I wasn't alone in that place, that something else was there with me. I tried the door again, and this time it creaked open. I dashed out, not looking back, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from that place. I reached my room, panting, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. It felt like a nightmare, this surreal encounter with something I couldn't explain. I debated reporting it to the hotel staff, but I felt this overwhelming fear that they wouldn't believe me, or worse, that they were somehow involved. I barely slept, haunted by the images of that room, those people, that feeling of being watched and trapped. I felt this overwhelming sense of dread, this fear that I had stumbled upon something dark and dangerous. The next morning, I tried to gather my courage and went to the front desk. I asked about the closed-off floor, trying to sound casual, but the receptionist looked puzzled, saying that floor had been closed for renovations for years. It didn't make sense. What I saw wasn't any renovation, it was something else, something inexplicable. I debated leaving, forgetting about it, but the curiosity nagged at me. I decided to investigate further, trying to find any information about that strange floor. I searched the internet, dug into the hotel's history, but there was nothing, no mention of any rituals or secret gatherings. It felt like I had stumbled into a mystery, something hidden and sinister. That night, I heard whispers again, faint but there, this feeling of déjà vu that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake off the fear. I decided to check out early, to leave that place behind, but as I packed my bags, I felt this overwhelming sense of being watched. I looked around, but there was no one there. It felt like that strange encounter was following me, haunting me wherever I went. I left the hotel, feeling this immense relief to be out of there. I was staying at this fancy hotel for a work conference, you know, the kind where you're there for business but also hoping to network and maybe have a good time. The concierge, Mr. Davis, seemed pleasant enough at first. He offered tips about places to visit around the city, But then he mentioned this off-site event, saying it was a fantastic opportunity for networking. I wasn't really interested, but Mr. Davis was insistent, almost too insistent. He kept talking about how it was a chance of a lifetime and how influential people would be there. I felt this growing discomfort, this pressure to say yes even though I didn't want to go. I tried to politely decline, but he persisted, saying it was an exclusive gathering and that I couldn't miss it. I felt this unease creeping up on me, this feeling that something wasn't right. He wouldn't take no for an answer, almost as if he was trying too hard to convince me. I felt this growing fear, this sense that he had an ulterior motive. I finally agreed just to get him off my back, thinking maybe I was overthinking things. But as the evening approached, I felt this increasing dread, this fear of what awaited me at that event. I got dressed, trying to shake off the unease, but the feeling lingered. Mr. Davis escorted me outside, where a car was waiting. I asked where we were going, but he just smiled and said it was a surprise. The drive felt endless, and my anxiety was through the roof. I kept asking where we were headed, but Mr. Davis just brushed off my questions with vague answers. I felt this growing panic, this fear of the unknown, of being taken somewhere against my will. We arrived at this secluded mansion, and something felt off right away. The place was dimly lit, and there were only a few cars parked outside. It wasn't the glamorous event Mr. Davis had described. As I stepped inside, I realized it was just a handful of people, all strangers, all with these fake smiles plastered on their faces. I felt this overwhelming sense of discomfort, this fear that I had made a terrible mistake by coming here. Mr. Davis left, saying he'd be back soon, leaving me alone with these strangers. I tried to mingle, to strike up conversations, but they were all vague, evasive even. It was like they were hiding something, like there was an unspoken secret among them. I felt this urge to leave, this growing terror that something bad was about to happen. I made an excuse to go to the restroom, hoping to find a way out, but the doors were locked. Panic surged through me. I was trapped. I tried calling Mr. Davis, but there was no answer. I felt this overwhelming fear, this sense of being lured into a trap. I heard whispers, faint but distinct, and I followed the sound, hoping it was a way out. It led me to a door slightly ajar, and I peeked inside. What I saw froze me in terror. There were people in masks, conducting some sort of ceremony. I couldn't make out what they were doing, but it felt sinister, something beyond my worst nightmares. I felt this overwhelming urge to run, to escape that place, but my body wouldn't move. Fear rooted me to the spot, this terror of being caught, of what would happen if they found me spying on them. I heard footsteps approaching, this slow, deliberate sound that sent chills down my spine. I darted away, trying to find another way out, but it was like the walls were closing in on me. Panic set in, this feeling of being trapped in a nightmare. I finally found a door, and it opened to the outside. I ran, not looking back, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from that place. I found a cab, and I went straight to the hotel, trembling and terrified. I reported everything to the hotel management, but they looked at me like I was crazy, like I had imagined it all. I felt this lingering fear, this trauma from the chilling encounter, this realization that I had narrowly escaped something unimaginable. I was staying at this hotel down south, visiting family for a few days. It was a normal evening. I was heading up to my room after dinner when the elevator doors opened. There was a guy already inside, and he seemed a bit off, jittery almost. I nodded, polite-like, and he responded with this nervous smile. I pressed my floor number, and the elevator started its ascent. But then, it just stopped abruptly between floors. I felt this sinking feeling in my stomach, this panic rising as the lights flickered and the elevator jolted to a halt. I tried pressing the buttons, but nothing responded. The other guy, he started pacing, muttering to himself. I tried to stay calm, to reassure him that help would come soon, but he seemed agitated, on edge. Time passed, and it felt like forever trapped in that tiny space. The guy's behavior got more erratic, like he was on the edge of losing it. He kept muttering, pacing faster, and his eyes darted around as if he was seeing things that weren't there. I felt this growing fear, this sense that something wasn't right about him. I tried making small talk to distract him, to keep things calm, but he didn't respond, just kept muttering under his breath. Then, he suddenly stopped, dead still, and turned to me with this wild look in his eyes. He started talking, but it was like he was speaking in riddles, words that didn't make sense, this disjointed rambling about being trapped and not getting out. I felt this overwhelming sense of dread, this fear that I was stuck in that elevator with someone unstable, someone who might do something unpredictable. He got closer, too close for comfort, and I backed away, my heart pounding. I tried to reason with him, to calm him down, but it was like he was in another world, lost in his own thoughts. I heard this metallic scraping sound, and I looked down to see him scratching at the elevator doors, his fingers leaving streaks of blood. It was chilling, this sight of someone so desperate, so unhinged. I shouted for help, pressing the emergency button, but there was no response. It felt like we were forgotten, abandoned in that malfunctioning elevator. He started pounding on the walls, this frenzied desperation in his actions. I felt this overwhelming sense of danger, this fear that I was trapped with someone capable of anything. I tried to keep my distance, to stay away from him, but the confined space made it impossible to avoid him completely. I felt this growing terror, this realization that I was in a dangerous situation. He suddenly lunged at me, this wild look in his eyes. I dodged, but he grabbed my arm, his grip tight and frantic. I struggled, trying to break free, my heart racing with fear. The elevator jolted, and the lights flickered again. I used that moment of distraction to break loose, to push him away and create some distance between us. I huddled in the corner, trying to catch my breath, my mind racing with fear and adrenaline. He was still muttering, pacing back and forth, this unsettling presence that made my skin crawl. I prayed for help, for someone to rescue us from that nightmare. Time passed in a blur, each minute feeling like an eternity, the fear gnawing at me. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the elevator started moving again, slowly inching towards the nearest floor. The doors opened, and I bolted out, not looking back, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from that guy. I reported the incident to the hotel staff, but they brushed it off, saying it was just a malfunction. I was on a trip for work, booked a room at this hotel, seemed alright at first. But the room I got, it felt off somehow, this weird vibe that made me uneasy. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but something about it just didn't sit right. The air was heavy, and there was this strange smell, musty and stale. It made me feel on edge, this discomfort that I couldn't shake off. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe I was being too sensitive, but as the night crept in, the unease grew. It was like this feeling of being watched, this sense that something wasn't right about that room. I barely slept, tossing and turning, feeling this growing fear that kept me wide awake. There were these faint noises, creaks and whispers that I couldn't explain. It felt like the room had a life of its own, and it wasn't a friendly one. The next morning, I asked the hotel staff for a room change, citing some made-up reason about the air conditioning not working right. They obliged and gave me a new room on a different floor. But as soon as I stepped into the new room, it was worse. The air was stifling, this heavy feeling pressing down on me. It felt colder, but not in a comforting way, more like a chilling, bone-deep coldness. I tried to shake it off, to tell myself it was just my imagination, but the room had this eerie stillness, this suffocating silence that sent shivers down my spine. I noticed things were off. The paintings on the walls, they were crooked, like someone had hurriedly put them up. The curtains fluttered, even though there was no draft, no open window. I felt this overwhelming sense of discomfort, this fear that something wasn't right about that room. It felt like it was hiding something, something dark and unsettling. The lights flickered, and I heard this faint scratching noise, like nails against the walls. I searched the room, but there was no source, no explanation for the sound. I tried to leave, to ask for yet another room change, but when I opened the door, it wouldn't budge. It was like it was stuck, locked from the outside. Panic set in, this feeling of being trapped in that unsettling room. I tried calling the front desk, but the phone didn't work. I felt this growing terror, this fear that I was alone in that eerie place. The temperature dropped, and I saw my breath misting in front of me. I shivered, this chill that went right down to my bones. It felt like the room was getting colder, this freezing cold that seeped into my skin. I heard whispers, faint at first, then growing louder, this unintelligible murmur that filled the room. I felt this overwhelming sense of dread, this fear that I wasn't alone, that something else was there with me. I saw shadows moving, flickering in the corners of the room. I tried to rationalize, to tell myself it was just my imagination, but it felt too real, too terrifying to be dismissed. I felt this urge to get out, this primal need to escape that unsettling room. I pushed at the door with all my strength, finally managing to force it open. I ran out, not looking back, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from that room. I went straight to the hotel staff, trying to explain what had happened, but they looked at me like I was crazy. They assured me that there was no issue with the rooms, that everything was fine. But I knew what I had experienced. It was real, this nightmare I couldn't explain. I was staying at this hotel, you see. It was a big deal for me because I was meeting my long-lost family the next day. I'd never seen them before, and the excitement was mixed with nerves. It was late in the evening, and I was going through some papers in my room, getting everything ready for the meeting. That's when I heard this soft rustling sound at the door. I thought it might be room service or something, but when I checked, there was no one there. Curious, I looked around, and on the floor, I found this folded paper. It was a note, and the words on it made my blood run cold. It said, "Leave this hotel now if you value your life." My heart pounded, and my hands trembled as I read it over and over, trying to make sense of it. I felt this growing fear, this sense of impending danger that I couldn't ignore. I checked the door, but there was no one outside, no one nearby. I tried to dismiss it as a prank, as someone messing around, but the note felt real, too real to be taken lightly. I called the front desk, trying to sound casual, asking if there had been any security issues in the hotel lately. The receptionist assured me that everything was fine, but I couldn't shake off that feeling of unease. I double-checked the locks, pulled the curtain shut, trying to feel safe, but the fear lingered, this terror of the unknown. I barely slept that night, tossing and turning, the warning note haunting my thoughts. I kept looking out the window, expecting something to happen, someone to show up. Morning came, and I hesitated about going to meet my family. But I couldn't let fear dictate my life, right? So, I gathered my courage and headed downstairs, trying to keep a calm facade. I met my family, and it was a mix of emotions, excitement, and anxiety. They were welcoming, happy to see me, but in the back of my mind, that note lingered, this fear that something was wrong. We spent the day together, catching up, sharing stories, and for a moment, I almost forgot about the ominous warning. But as evening approached, that fear returned, this sense that danger was looming. I went back to my room, trying to push away the feeling of dread. I opened the door, and there, on the floor, was another note. This one was even more direct, more menacing. It said, "You've been warned. Leave now, or else." I felt this chilling shiver run down my spine, this fear that someone was watching me, someone who wanted me out of that hotel, out of their way. I called the front desk again, trying to sound composed, but inside, I was panicking. I asked if they could check the security cameras or if they had seen anything suspicious. They promised to look into it, but their reassurances did little to ease my fear. I couldn't stay there any longer. The warning was too ominous, too threatening. I packed my bags in a rush, this growing terror pushing me to leave that place. As I left the room, I noticed this figure at the end of the hallway, someone wearing a hood, their face obscured. They turned and vanished around the corner before I could make out any features. Panic surged through me, this fear that someone was following me, someone who meant harm. I rushed to the front desk, told them I had to leave immediately, that I was feeling sick and needed to go. They didn't question it, just helped me check out quickly. I left the hotel, feeling this overwhelming sense of relief mixed with terror, this fear that I had narrowly escaped something dangerous. I was working security at this hotel, my usual night shift routine. It was quiet, just me and the surveillance monitors flickering with the footage from the cameras across the floors. Around midnight, I noticed something odd. There was this figure on the screen, slipping into different rooms while the guests were out. It was eerie, this sense of intrusion that made my skin crawl. I thought it might be a mistake, a glitch in the system, but as I kept watching, I saw it happening repeatedly, different rooms, different floors. Someone was definitely sneaking into the guests' rooms. I felt this growing dread, this fear that something sinister was happening right under our noses. I called the front desk, but they assured me that everything was fine, that there were no security breaches. I couldn't shake off the feeling of responsibility, this need to protect the guests, so I decided to investigate. I went up to one of the floors where I'd seen the intruder on the cameras. As I walked down the hallway, the silence was suffocating. I checked the rooms, and they seemed undisturbed from the outside. But that sense of someone watching, someone sneaking around, it made my heart race. I reached a room that had been targeted on the camera feed. I knocked, announcing myself as hotel security, but there was no response. I used the master key to unlock the door, slowly pushing it open. The room looked normal, but something felt off. I went in, scanning every corner, checking closets and under the bed, but there was no sign of anyone. I felt this chill run down my spine, this overwhelming sense of unease. I couldn't shake off the feeling that someone had been there, that they might still be lurking around. I went back to the security room, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I reviewed the footage again, this time focusing on the areas where the intruder had entered the rooms. That's when I saw it, this shadow moving swiftly down the hallway, slipping into another room. It was chilling, this figure moving with such stealth, such precision. I called the front desk again, trying to explain what I'd found, but they brushed it off, saying it was probably a maintenance worker or something. But I knew what I'd seen. It wasn't right. It wasn't normal. I continued monitoring the cameras, my eyes glued to the screens, watching for any sign of that intruder. I felt this knot in my stomach, this fear that something dangerous was happening and no one was taking it seriously. Hours passed, and then I saw it again. That same figure, moving between rooms, like they knew exactly where to go, exactly when to strike. I couldn't just sit there. I had to do something. I rushed to the floors where the intruder had been spotted, trying to catch a glimpse, trying to put a stop to it. But every time I got close, every time I thought I might catch them, they vanished, as if they knew I was coming. It was unnerving, this game of cat and mouse, this fear of the unknown. I called the police, trying to explain the situation, but without solid proof, they couldn't do much. I felt this frustration, this helplessness in the face of something so unsettling. The night dragged on, and the intruder continued their silent invasion of the guests' rooms. I felt this growing sense of dread, this fear that something terrible might happen, that the guests might be in danger. I tried to keep watch, to stay alert, but the fear gnawed at me, this realization that I couldn't protect everyone, that I might not be able to stop whatever was happening. Finally, as dawn approached, the intruder vanished from the cameras. I felt this mix of relief and fear, this uncertainty about what had just occurred. The next day, I reported everything to the hotel management, but they dismissed it, saying it was probably a technical glitch or a mistake in the system. But I knew what I'd seen, what I'd witnessed on those cameras. It was real, too real to be ignored. I was staying at this hotel for a business conference, just a routine trip. The place seemed decent enough at first glance, you know? But things started getting weird real quick. I overheard a conversation between some staff members about the hotel's past. They spoke in hushed tones about these unsolved disappearances that had happened years ago. People just vanished without a trace, and the cases were never solved. It sent a chill down my spine, this sinister vibe that lingered in the air. I tried to brush it off as gossip, but there was this lingering feeling that something wasn't right about this place. That night, as I was about to fall asleep, strange things started happening. I heard these faint whispers, like voices echoing in the room, but there was no one there. It felt like the walls held secrets, secrets I wasn't supposed to know. The air grew heavy, suffocating almost. It was like this invisible weight pressing down on me. I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched, this unsettling sensation that someone or something was lurking in the shadows. I turned on all the lights, trying to push away the fear, but it didn't help. The room felt colder, this bone-chilling coldness that made me shiver. It wasn't just a draft, it felt unnatural. Then, there were these odd occurrences. My belongings started disappearing, small things at first, like my pen or hairbrush. I thought I was being forgetful, misplacing them, but then it escalated. I'd leave the room for a few minutes, and when I returned, everything would be rearranged. Furniture moved, items shifted around. It was as if someone had been in there while I was out, but the door was always locked. I couldn't shake off this feeling of dread, this fear that I was caught in something I couldn't explain. I asked the hotel staff, but they dismissed it, said it was probably just my imagination. One night, I woke up to this sound, this scraping noise coming from inside the walls. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, this persistent scratching that made my blood run cold. I felt this primal fear, this terror that something was trying to get in, something sinister and unexplainable. I called the front desk, but they didn't take me seriously. They promised to send someone to check, but no one came. I tried to sleep, to ignore the sounds, but they continued, this relentless scratching that seemed to come from all directions. I felt this overwhelming sense of being trapped, this fear that something was lurking just beyond the walls. Then, there were these moments of darkness, like the lights flickering for no reason. It wasn't a power surge, it felt intentional, this eerie darkness that lasted just a moment but left me trembling. I couldn't take it anymore. I requested to change rooms, hoping it would make things better, but it only got worse. The strange occurrences followed me, this feeling of being trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. I started seeing things, shadows moving in the corners, shapes that shouldn't have been there. I tried to convince myself it was my mind playing tricks, but it felt too real, too terrifying to be just my imagination. The whispers returned, this time clearer, as if they were trying to tell me something, but I couldn't understand. It was like voices from another time, another dimension, haunting me with their secrets. I researched the hotel's history, digging into those unsolved disappearances. It sent chills down my spine. It was true. People had gone missing from here, without a trace, without any explanation. The fear consumed me, this terror of not knowing what was happening, this feeling that the hotel held dark secrets that were meant to stay hidden. I tried to leave, to check out and put an end to this nightmare, but something stopped me. It was as if the hotel itself didn't want me to leave, as if it was holding me captive in its sinister grip. I felt this overwhelming sense of being watched, this feeling that someone or something was always there, just out of sight. It was suffocating, this fear that I was at the mercy of forces beyond my understanding. In the end, I left, but the terror stayed with me. It felt like I had escaped a nightmare. I checked into this hotel for a weekend getaway, just looking for some peace and quiet. But things took a weird turn real fast. From the moment I arrived, there was this guy, another guest, who seemed to be fixated on me. He was always around, too close for comfort, like he was watching my every move. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, you know? Maybe we just happened to be in the same places at the same time. But then, I started noticing him everywhere I went in the hotel. He'd show up in the lobby when I checked in, at the restaurant during meals, and even in the elevator when I was heading to my room. It was unsettling, this feeling of being constantly watched. He'd stare at me, this intense gaze that made me uncomfortable, like he was trying to convey something without saying a word. It sent shivers down my spine, this inexplicable fear of someone invading my space. I tried to avoid him, to keep my distance, but he'd always find a way to be near me. It was as if he was following my every move, this relentless pursuit that made my stay unbearable. Then, things got worse. He started leaving notes at my door, creepy messages that made my blood run cold. They were threatening, like he knew things about me, personal things that he shouldn't have known. I felt this growing fear, this sense of danger lurking around. I reported it to the hotel staff, but they brushed it off, said they'd look into it, but nothing changed. I started feeling paranoid, this constant anxiety of not knowing when he'd show up next, what he might do. It was suffocating, this fear that I was being targeted by someone with ill intentions. He'd approach me in the hallways, trying to start conversations that felt more like interrogations. He'd ask personal questions, things he had no business knowing, and it made me want to run, to get away from that place. I couldn't sleep. Every noise, every creak in the hotel made me jolt awake, this fear that he might try something while I was vulnerable. It was like living in a horror movie, this feeling of being trapped with no escape. I tried to change rooms, hoping it would help, but he'd find me again, this relentless pursuit that made my skin crawl. I felt this overwhelming sense of being targeted, this fear that he wouldn't stop until he had what he wanted. The hotel staff didn't take it seriously, said they couldn't kick out a guest without evidence of wrongdoing. But it felt like they weren't listening, like they didn't understand the terror I was living through. I kept my door locked at all times, double-checking the locks every few minutes, this fear that he might try to get in. I didn't feel safe, not even in my own room, this constant dread that he was just outside, waiting. I couldn't enjoy my stay, this cloud of fear hanging over me, this feeling that I was being hunted by someone who wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. Finally, I had enough. I packed my bags and checked out, this overwhelming relief flooding me as I left that place. But the fear stayed with me, this trauma of being harassed, this fear that he might follow me, that I might never feel safe again. I reported everything to the authorities, but without solid evidence, they couldn't do much. I felt this frustration, this helplessness in the face of someone who made my life a living nightmare. I never knew why he fixated on me, what he wanted, but it haunted me long after I left that hotel. I checked into this hotel for a week-long business trip, but things started getting weird from the get-go. The room was clean when I first entered, everything in its place, but soon I felt like something wasn't right. At first, it was just small things, you know? Like my belongings seemed slightly misplaced. I thought I might have been forgetful, you know, placing things in odd spots, but it started happening too frequently. I'd leave for meetings and come back to find things slightly shifted, as if someone had been through my stuff. It was subtle, so subtle that I brushed it off as my own absent-mindedness, but it kept happening. Then there were these clues, unsettling hints that something wasn't right. I'd find a piece of paper with cryptic messages, almost like riddles, hidden among my things. It made me uneasy, like someone was playing a twisted game with me. I started suspecting the housekeeping staff, thinking maybe they were going through my belongings. But when I mentioned it to the hotel management, they assured me that their staff was trustworthy and professional. They dismissed my concerns, said it must have been a misunderstanding. But the clues kept appearing, getting more disturbing with each one. I'd find notes under the bed, in drawers, sometimes even in plain sight, and they were always about me, my schedule, my habits. It felt invasive, like someone was observing my every move. I tried to rationalize it, you know? Maybe it was a prank, or someone playing mind games. But deep down, I knew there was something more sinister at play. Then there was this smell, this foul odor that lingered in the room. It wasn't just unpleasant, it was nauseating, like something rotting. I complained to the staff, but they said they couldn't detect any unusual odors. It was like I was the only one smelling it. The room felt colder, too, even with the thermostat set to a comfortable temperature. It was this bone-chilling coldness that seemed to seep into my bones, making me shiver even under the blankets. I started feeling watched, this sensation of ice pouring into me even when I was alone. It was unnerving, this constant feeling that someone was lurking just out of sight, observing my every move. Then there were these noises at night, faint whispers that I couldn't quite make out. It was like hushed conversations just beyond the walls, but when I listened closely, they'd fade away, leaving me with this eerie silence. I decided to set up a camera, hoping to catch whoever was behind this. But when I reviewed the footage, there was nothing unusual, just me going about my business in the room. It made me question my sanity, this feeling of being trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I felt this overwhelming sense of unease, this fear that I wasn't alone, that someone was in there with me, invisible but present. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, this fear that someone or something was lurking just beyond my sight. I checked the room, the closets, under the bed, but there was never anything there. I felt this desperation, this need to escape, but I had nowhere else to go. The hotel was fully booked, and I was stuck in that room, surrounded by this suffocating sense of dread. Then things escalated. I found scratches on the walls, these claw-like marks that seemed to appear overnight. It sent chills down my spine, this feeling that something malevolent was in that room with me. I started losing track of time, feeling disoriented, like the room was playing tricks on me. It was like the walls were closing in, this feeling of being trapped in a space that was becoming increasingly hostile. I reported everything to the hotel management, begged them to change my room, but they insisted that there were no available rooms. It felt like they weren't taking me seriously, like they thought I was making it all up. I felt this overwhelming fear, this terror of not knowing what was happening, this sense of being targeted by something I couldn't explain. I wanted to leave, to run away from that place, but it was like the hotel itself didn't want me to go. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, this constant state of fear consuming me. Every sound, every shadow in that room felt menacing, this feeling that something sinister was lurking just beyond my sight. I felt this urgency to get out, to escape before something terrible happened. I packed my bags and checked out early, leaving that hotel behind me, but the fear stayed with me. I never found out who or what was behind it all, those unsettling clues, the eerie atmosphere in that room. For some context, I am a writer and often book trips alone. So this one time I booked a room in this hotel for a quick getaway, looking forward to a peaceful stay. But things took a turn that I never expected. It started with a series of strange wake-up calls. At first, I thought it was just an error, you know? The phone ringing in the early hours of the morning, pulling me out of a deep sleep. But when I answered, there was nothing but silence. It happened every night, the phone ringing persistently, always at 3 a.m. I tried calling back, but there was no response, just an eerie silence on the other end. I felt this growing sense of unease, this fear that something wasn't right. It was unsettling, this routine of waking up to an unanswered call in the dead of night. Then, things got weirder. I started finding cryptic messages scattered around my room, like someone had been leaving them for me. They were disturbing, these nonsensical phrases that made no sense at all. The messages were written on scraps of paper, hidden in drawers, under the bed, sometimes even taped to the mirror. They were always about me, my habits, my schedule, things that felt too personal for a stranger to know. I felt this growing anxiety, this fear that someone was watching me, observing my every move. I reported it to the hotel staff, but they couldn't find any evidence of someone tampering with my room. They said it must have been a mistake, but it felt deliberate, targeted. I couldn't shake off this feeling of being watched, this fear that someone was lurking just out of sight, playing this twisted game with me. The wake-up calls continued, always at 3 a.m., always with that eerie silence on the other end. It became a torment, this dread of the phone ringing in the middle of the night. I started losing sleep, this constant fear weighing me down. Every time the phone rang, I felt this wave of terror wash over me, this fear that someone might be in the room with me. Then, I noticed things out of place. My belongings shifted slightly, as if someone had been going through my stuff. It was subtle, so subtle that I questioned my own memory, but it happened too frequently to ignore. I'd find my clothes rearranged, my toiletries moved, and sometimes even missing. It was unsettling, this feeling that someone was invading my privacy, this fear that I wasn't safe in my own room. I tried to change rooms, hoping to escape whatever was happening, but it didn't stop. The wake-up calls continued, the cryptic messages persisted, and I felt this overwhelming sense of dread, this fear that someone was targeting me. I started feeling paranoid, this constant anxiety of not knowing who was behind it all. I checked the room multiple times before going to bed, double-checking the locks, searching for any signs of intrusion. But there was nothing, no evidence, no explanation for what was happening. It was like living in a nightmare, this fear that someone was playing a sick game with my sanity. I couldn't trust anyone, not even the hotel staff, this fear that whoever was behind it had eyes and ears everywhere. I felt trapped, this suffocating feeling of being pursued by an unseen threat. I reached out to the authorities, hoping they could help, but without solid evidence, they couldn't do much. It felt like I was on my own, facing this terror alone. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my bags, checked out early, leaving that hotel behind me. But the fear stayed with me, this trauma of feeling targeted, this fear that whoever was behind it might follow me. I booked a room in a motel on the outskirts of town, looking forward to a quiet night after a long drive. But things didn't quite go as planned. The room was alright, nothing fancy, but it felt cozy enough. That's until I heard noises coming from the room next door, faint at first, but they grew louder as the night wore on. At first, I thought it was just typical motel noise, you know, guests coming and going, but there was something off about it. It wasn't the usual chatter or footsteps, it sounded like hushed conversations, whispers that I couldn't quite make out. I tried to ignore it, burying myself under the covers, but the noise persisted. It was almost constant, these murmurs that felt more secretive than casual. It made me uneasy, this feeling that something wasn't right next door. Then there were these odd hours when guests would enter and leave the room. It was irregular, not the usual comings and goings you'd expect at a motel. Sometimes it'd be in the dead of night, sometimes early morning, but always with this furtive air about it. I started feeling this growing sense of unease, this paranoia creeping in. I couldn't shake off the feeling that something suspicious was happening in that room next door. I tried to listen in, press my ear against the wall, hoping to catch a snippet of their conversations, but it was always too faint, too indistinct to understand. It was frustrating, this curiosity mixed with fear. Then, there were these smells, strange odors wafting through the walls, something chemical, almost acrid. It made me nauseous, this stench that lingered in the air, lingering long after the guests next door had gone. I tried to rationalize it, thinking maybe it was just cleaning products or something, but it didn't smell like any typical cleaner. It felt more pungent, more unsettling. I became fixated, obsessed almost, with the activities of the guests next door. I'd stay up late, listening intently, trying to decipher what was happening, but it was always a frustrating mystery. I started feeling this paranoia, this fear that something sinister was happening right next to me. It was like I was a part of some twisted thriller, and I couldn't shake off this feeling of impending danger. I reported it to the motel staff, but they brushed it off, said they hadn't received any complaints from other guests. They dismissed my concerns, said it must have been a misunderstanding. But I couldn't let it go. It consumed my thoughts, this fear that something terrible was unfolding next door. I couldn't sleep, couldn't relax, this constant fear gnawing at me. Then, one night, there was silence. No murmurs, no odd movements, just an eerie quietness that unsettled me even more. It was like the calm before a storm, this anticipation of something ominous. I debated calling the authorities, but what would I tell them? That I suspected my neighbors of suspicious activities without any evidence? It felt futile, this sense of helplessness. I became hyper-aware of every sound, every movement next door. I'd spend hours pacing in my room, trying to catch a glimpse of anything through the thin curtains, but there was nothing. I felt this paranoia, this fear that something terrible was about to happen. It was like living on the edge of a nightmare, this sense of impending doom. I couldn't take it anymore. I checked out early, leaving that motel behind me, but the fear stayed with me. I booked a room in this hotel for a night away from my hectic life, aiming for a comfortable stay. But what unfolded during those few days was something I'd rather forget. It started innocently enough, just routine check-in, handing over my ID, getting the room key. But the receptionist, there was something off about him. He seemed jittery, nervous, like he was on edge. As I settled into my room, I couldn't shake off this uneasy feeling that lingered after that brief interaction. But I tried to brush it off. You know, maybe he was just having a rough day. Then, strange things started happening. The first night, I called down to reception because the TV remote wasn't working. And who shows up? That same receptionist. He looked disheveled, almost like he wasn't expecting to be called. and he seemed surprised to see me. He fumbled with the remote, muttering something under his breath, this nervous energy radiating from him. It was uncomfortable, this feeling that something wasn't right, but I tried to be polite and thanked him. But then, he lingered. He kept asking odd questions, like if I was enjoying my stay, and if I needed anything else. It was almost like he was trying too hard to keep the conversation going, this forced friendliness that made me uneasy. I couldn't shake off this feeling that something wasn't right about him. He seemed agitated, constantly shifting his weight, looking over his shoulder as if he was expecting someone to appear. The next day, I saw him again, lurking in the hallway near my room. It was odd, this feeling that he was watching me, this sense of being observed. I tried to avoid eye contact, slipped into my room quickly, hoping to escape his attention. But it didn't stop there. Every time I left or entered my room, he'd be there, this unsettling presence that made my skin crawl. It was like he was fixated on me, this strange and unwelcome attention. I tried talking to other hotel staff, hoping to switch rooms or something, but they just brushed it off, said he was a bit eccentric, nothing to worry about. But I knew there was something more to it, this sense of danger that I couldn't shake off. Then, one night, there was a knock on my door. I opened it, thinking it was room service or something, but it was him, that receptionist. He stood there, staring at me, this intense gaze that sent shivers down my spine. He mumbled something about needing to check something in the room, but it felt off, this excuse that didn't quite make sense. I refused, told him everything was fine, but he insisted, this insistence that felt forceful. I closed the door on him, locked it, feeling this fear settling in, this fear that he might try something. I stayed up that night, listening intently, fearing that he might come back, that he might try to enter my room again. The next morning, I reported everything to the hotel manager, told them about his behavior, his strange visits, but they just dismissed it, said they'd talk to him. It felt futile, this fear that they weren't taking it seriously. I felt this growing paranoia, this fear that he might try something, that I might not be safe in that hotel. I started checking the locks multiple times, this constant fear that he might barge in. I tried to spend as little time in the hotel as possible, only returning to my room to sleep. But every time I did, I felt this sense of dread, this fear that I was being watched. I checked into this hotel for a conference, excited for a weekend of networking and learning. But little did I know, it would turn into a nightmarish experience I'd never forget. It all started when the fire alarm went off. It blared through the speakers, this shrill sound that jolted everyone awake. At first, it felt like a false alarm, something faulty, but the urgency in that sound made me uneasy. People started pouring out of their rooms, the hallways filling up with panicked guests, all scrambling to get to the nearest exits. There was this sense of chaos, this fear-driven frenzy that gripped everyone. I grabbed my essentials, my phone, and my bag, rushing toward the exit. But as I reached the staircase, I could see smoke billowing from downstairs, thick and acrid. It hit me, this sinking feeling that something was terribly wrong. The air felt heavy with tension and fear as people struggled to evacuate. The alarm blared relentlessly, this deafening noise that added to the panic. There were shouts, screams, people trying to navigate through the chaos. It was overwhelming, this rush of bodies trying to escape, this fear that we might not make it out in time. The smoke grew thicker, this dense haze that made it hard to see. I covered my mouth with my sleeve, trying to breathe through the acrid air, this fear gripping my chest. People were pushing and shoving, trying to get ahead. It felt like everyone was fighting for their lives, this sense of survival that overtook the hotel corridors. I tried to stay calm, tried to find a way out, but the exits were crowded, blocked almost. Panic was spreading, this sense of desperation that clouded everyone's judgment. I heard someone yelling, shouting that it might be a real fire. That realization hit me like a ton of bricks, this fear that we might be trapped, that there might be a fire raging below us. The fear was palpable, this sense of imminent danger that lingered in the air. I could feel my heart racing, this dread of what might happen next. I followed the crowd, trying to move toward an exit, but it was like swimming against a current. People were scared, confused, and it was chaos all around. I saw some guests trying to use the elevators, but that felt like a bad idea, this sense that they might get stuck in there if there was indeed a fire. I made it to the stairwell, but the smoke was creeping up, this dark cloud that made it hard to breathe. I hesitated, this fear of descending into something even more dangerous. The sounds of sirens outside added to the panic, this sense that the situation might be worse than we thought. I could feel my hands trembling, this fear gripping me tighter. I took a deep breath and started descending the stairs. The smoke was suffocating, this stench that made my eyes water, my throat burn. As I got to the lower floors, the smoke was thicker. I could barely see, barely breathe, this fear that I might not make it out alive. I reached the lobby, but it was chaotic. People were shouting, crying, this sense of desperation taking over. The fire alarm was still blaring, this constant reminder of the danger we were in. I saw firefighters rushing in, battling the blaze. But it felt like time was standing still, this fear that we might not get out in time. I made it outside, finally, gulping in the fresh air. But the fear stayed with me, this horror of what just happened, this fear that it could have been so much worse. As I watched the firefighters working tirelessly, I felt this sense of gratitude, this relief that I made it out, this fear lingering that it was a close call. It turned out to be a false alarm triggered by a malfunctioning smoke detector. But the terror of those moments, that chaos and fear, it stayed with me, this nightmare I hoped to forget but couldn't shake off. I was staying at this hotel for a weekend getaway, expecting a peaceful time away from the daily grind. Little did I know that weekend would haunt me for years to come. It all started when I took a wrong turn trying to find the hotel gym. I thought I'd explore the basement to find the right way. The corridor seemed normal at first, lined with doors marked staff only and maintenance. But then, I noticed a door slightly ajar, one that wasn't labeled. Curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the door open, stepping into this dark, dimly lit space. It felt wrong, this unease settling in as I ventured deeper. The air grew cold, this chill that crept under my skin. The corridor seemed endless, lined with flickering lights and this silence that was almost suffocating. As I moved cautiously, the corridor seemed to narrow, this feeling of being trapped settling in. I almost turned back, but then I stumbled upon a room that seemed out of place. The door was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open, stepping into this room that felt like a forbidden secret. It was dark, with only faint light seeping through a small window. But what I saw froze me in place. The room was filled with old, rusty equipment, broken furniture, and piles of discarded items. But that wasn't the worst part. There were these disturbing paintings on the walls, crude drawings that sent shivers down my spine. I couldn't make out what they depicted at first, but as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw these horrifying images, grotesque and unsettling. They depicted scenes of violence, twisted figures, and faces contorted in agony. It felt like the air itself had thickened, this heaviness that made it hard to breathe. I wanted to leave, to run away, but this morbid curiosity kept me rooted to the spot. I noticed something in the corner, a stack of old journals and dusty papers. They seemed to detail strange occurrences, cryptic writings that I couldn't quite comprehend. But the fear was growing, this sense of being in a place I shouldn't be. I heard something then, a faint sound that made my heart race. It was this low, guttural noise that echoed through the room. I froze, this fear gripping me as I strained to listen. It was a voice, a whisper that sent chills down my spine. It was unintelligible at first, but then it grew clearer, this sound that was almost like chanting. I couldn't place where it was coming from, this fear that I might not be alone. I turned to leave, this urgent need to get out of there, but then the door slammed shut behind me. It was this deafening noise that reverberated through the room, trapping me in this eerie space. I panicked, trying to push the door open, but it wouldn't budge. It felt like I was in a nightmare, this fear that I might never escape, that something sinister lurked in that basement. I felt this presence, this feeling of being watched, and I turned, almost expecting to see something dreadful. But there was nothing there, just a room filled with those chilling paintings. I banged on the door, screamed for help, but it was like I was in this isolated bubble, this fear that no one would hear me. Then, I heard footsteps approaching, this slow and deliberate movement that made my blood run cold. It felt like my heart was about to burst out of my chest as the sound grew closer. I turned toward the source of the sound, but there was nothing there. It was this fear of the unknown, this terror of what might come next. And then, as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. The room fell into an eerie silence, this dread that settled in the air like a thick fog. I don't know how long I was trapped in there, this fear that time itself had stopped. But then, the door creaked open, and I stumbled out into the corridor, this overwhelming relief flooding through me. I rushed back to my room, locked the door, and tried to make sense of what happened. But those images, those haunting paintings, they stayed etched in my mind, this fear that I stumbled upon something I was never meant to see.